It's the most incredible archaeological puzzle of the last millennium. The forbidden tomb of the man who ruled one of the largest empires ever known, Genghis Khan.
Have you ever wondered where some of the world's most famous figures are really buried? While many graves are open for public visits, some remain hidden or completely off-limits. From legendary rulers to modern icons, these secret resting places hold stories the world may never fully uncover. Not all graves are open for public visits. Some are deliberately hidden or heavily guarded. But why? The reasons range from cultural beliefs to concerns about security and privacy. Throughout history, certain graves have been kept secret to prevent vandalism or idolization. For infamous figures like Adolf Hitler or Osama bin Laden, allowing public access could turn their resting places into shrines for extremists. In other cases, cultural traditions demand secrecy. For example, Mongolian customs surrounding Genghis Khan's burial ensured his grave would remain hidden forever, with those involved in the burial reportedly killed to protect its location. For some families, protecting a loved one's final resting place is about privacy. Public figures like Steve Jobs and Frank Zappa were buried in unmarked graves to avoid turning their resting places into tourist attractions. This decision shields their families from unwanted attention while preserving a sense of dignity. The first we have is Genghis Khan. The cruel Mongolian king built one of the largest countries in history, but he also left a puzzle for historians. Where is his grave? Even with a lot of research and high-tech tools, no one has ever found it. The quiet wasn't an accident, it was planned. According to a story, the people who buried him were killed to protect the spot. Some say that horses walked over the land to get rid of all evidence, while others say that rivers were changed to hide the tomb. Even now, the Mongolian government doesn't let people do study in areas that are thought to have his tomb. And what about the man behind World War II's most chilling events? Adolf Hitler. A lot of people think that Adolf Hitler's tomb was very fancy, but it wasn't. At the end of the war, Soviet troops took his body and did most of what they did after that to avoid future danger. Official reports say that his body burned outside of his cave and that the ashes were then secretly spread. The reason was to stop neo-Nazis from turning his tomb into a shrine. There is still no formal monument or marker to honor him. People were afraid that a public tomb would give radical groups ideas, which would support his bad views. Even though the public didn't know about it, the Soviet Union saved some of his bones for years. They want to get rid of all traces of him so that he has no effect at all. And Hitler wasn't the last infamous figure whose burial was kept a secret. Decades later, the US government took similar measures with a man who shook the world on September 11th, Osama bin Laden. It was not a chance that Osama bin Laden was killed by the US military in 2011. It was part of a well-planned operation to stop his followers from making him a symbol. Instead of a traditional funeral, bin Laden's body was quickly taken to the Arabian Sea and buried in secret. There was no monument, cemetery, or other place where leftists could gather. Why go through all that trouble? The US government knew that making his gravesite public could lead to more bloodshed or inspire people to become terrorists. Muslims follow certain funeral rules, but the whole thing was kept secret from everyone. But bin Laden isn't the only one. One of Hitler's most trusted men also disappeared into the shadows. Heinrich Himmler, who was one of the most hated leaders in Nazi Germany, was not buried in a dramatic way. When the Allies captured him in 1945, he killed himself to avoid being punished. But what happened to his body was just as sneaky as the bad things he did. British troops buried him in a grave that hasn't been named somewhere in northern Germany. No one knows for sure where it is. Why keep it secret? People made this choice on purpose to stop Nazi followers from making his tomb into a place of worship. Himmler was not just a soldier. He was in charge of the Holocaust and the deaths of millions of people. The British didn't say a word, and there was no record of the grave anywhere. And if you think that's the last hidden Nazi grave, you're wrong. Hitler's closest confidant also vanished without a trace. Martin Bormann, Hitler's right-hand man, but he fled as World War II ended. Many years ago, no one knew if he was alive or dead. In 1972, building workers in Berlin found human bones while they were digging. DNA tests later showed that it was Bormann. Still, the secretiveness didn't end. His ashes were scattered in a way that no one knew about, and the exact location was never made public. Like the graves of other high-ranking Nazis, Bormann's could become a place where extremists meet. The authorities didn't want anyone to turn him into a symbol of the Nazi cause. But it's not just political figures. Michael Jackson also has burial secrets that the world isn't meant to see. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, didn't live a life full of cameras, and his death is also a secret. His death was sudden in 2009, and he was buried in California at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in a private cemetery. You can't, however, visit his grave. The area is closed off to the public and is always under security. Because Jackson is famous all over the world, if the site were open, thousands of fans would flood it. The family wanted to keep people who were obsessed with him or who might do damage from going to his grave. John Wayne, one of America's most iconic cowboys, kept his grave out of sight for decades. When he died in 1979, John Wayne, the American cowboy hero, was surprisingly quiet. He was bigger than life. For more than 20 years, no one knew where he was buried. It was just a patch of grass in Newport Beach, California. There was no gravestone or other fancy marker. Wayne's family wanted him to be alone. They were afraid that the grave would become a place for tourists to visit, or even worse, someone would break into it. In 1998, a small sign was put up, but it's still easy to miss. As a nod to his tough guy image, the writing says, "Tomorrow is the most important thing in life." A beautiful monument is still missing, though. And also, one of the world's most influential tech geniuses also chose a quiet, unmarked grave. Steve Jobs changed the world with Apple, but after his death in 2011, his burial was as private as his personal life. He was laid to rest in an unmarked grave in Alta Mesa Memorial Park in Palo Alto, California. There's no sign, no flashy tribute, just a quiet, anonymous plot. It's in line with how Jobs lived. Despite his fame, he valued privacy and didn't want a public spectacle. His family also wanted to avoid turning his grave into a pilgrimage site for fans. While people leave flowers near the cemetery entrance, the exact location of his grave remains a mystery. We also have Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa, the musical genius known for his experimental sounds and biting social commentary, chose to leave this world as quietly as he lived privately. After his death in 1993, Zappa was buried in an unmarked plot at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. Despite his fame, his family respected his wishes for a modest, private resting place. For Zappa, fame never meant following the rules. Even in death, he rejected the idea of becoming a spectacle. And Zappa isn't the only famous face to disappear into anonymity. George C. Scott also chose a life away from the spotlight, even in death. George C. Scott, the legendary actor best known for his commanding role in Patton, was no fan of public attention. True to his private nature, when he passed away in 1999, he was buried in an unmarked grave at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery, just like Frank Zappa. Scott's aversion to public displays wasn't new. He famously refused his Academy Award for Patton because he believed that actors shouldn't compete against each other. This same philosophy extended to his death. No grand memorial, no fanfare. But it's not just celebrities. Some places are hidden for much darker reasons. And now we have Fred West. Fred West, one of Britain's most notorious serial killers, left behind a legacy of horror. Convicted of multiple murders, including those of his own family members, West's crimes shocked the nation. After his in prison in 1995, the government took extreme measures to prevent any public connection to his remains. His body was cremated and his ashes were secretly scattered in an undisclosed location. The fear? That a marked grave could become a twisted shrine, or a target for vigilante justice. And Fred West isn't the only criminal whose final resting place remains hidden. Wait for the next. Myra Hindley, alongside her partner Ian Brady, was responsible for the infamous Moors murders in the 1960s, crimes so horrific they haunt Britain to this day. Her cold and calculated actions made her a symbol of pure evil. When she died in 2002 after decades behind bars, public anger was still fierce. To avoid protests and grave desecration, authorities took no chances. Hindley's body was cremated, and her ashes were scattered in a secret location. No memorial, no marker, nothing to acknowledge her existence. But Hindley wasn't the last criminal to vanish after death. Another infamous killer met a similar fate. Harold Shipman, known as Dr. Death, was a British doctor who became one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Over his decades-long career, Shipman is believed to have murdered more than 200 patients under his care. When he took his own life in prison in 2004, the public's hatred didn't die with him. Authorities feared that any marked grave could become a place of outrage, or worse, fascination. His remains were cremated and scattered privately, with no public record of the location. And this pattern of secrecy isn't limited to historical figures. It extends. Seung-Hui Cho's 2007 shooting rampage at Virginia Tech remains one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. After killing 32 people before taking his own life, his actions left a scar on the nation's collective memory. When it came to his burial, secrecy was paramount. His family, fearing backlash and further pain for the victim's loved ones, chose to bury him in a private, undisclosed location. There are no public records, no accessible grave, only silence. But Cho's grave isn't the only one lost to secrecy. Another name remains hidden for the same reasons. Adam Lanza's brutal attack on Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012 shook the world. He took the lives of 26 people, most of them young children, before ending his own. The public's grief turned to anger, and his family knew there was no place for his memory to linger. Like other mass shooters, Lanza's burial remains a closely guarded secret. No one outside his immediate family knows where he was laid to rest. Some of Hollywood's most iconic figures also chose to keep their private lives hidden, even in death, and that is Plot E at Oise-Aisne American Cemetery. Hidden behind the manicured lawns of the Oise-Aisne American Cemetery in France lies a section most people don't even know exists, Plot E. This secret area isn't for war heroes. It's the final resting place for 94 American soldiers who were executed for serious crimes during and after World War II. Unlike the rest of the cemetery, Plot E is tucked away behind a dense hedge with no public access and no individual markers. These soldiers committed acts so heinous, mostly murder and rape, that the U.S. government decided their graves shouldn't be honored alongside fallen heroes. And it's not the only place where the dead are hidden. Some secrets go back centuries. In the days of the Ottoman Empire, executioners held terrifying power, but in death, they disappeared. These men carried out brutal punishments, from beheadings to torture, but no one wanted to remember them. That's why their graves were left unmarked and anonymous. People believed these executioners were cursed, and marking their graves could bring bad luck or invite revenge from angry families. So, after death, they were buried in secret spots with no headstones, erased from history to protect the living. Even now, most of their resting places remain unknown, hidden beneath modern Istanbul. Then clandestine graves in Mexico. Mexico holds a terrifying secret: thousands of unmarked graves hidden across the country. These are not forgotten cemeteries. They are burial sites tied to drug cartels, where victims of violence are dumped in secrecy. Authorities discover mass graves regularly, but for every site they find, many more remain hidden. Why so many? Cartels use these graves to cover up kidnappings, assassinations, and disappearances. Victims range from rival gang members to innocent people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Families search for their missing loved ones, but many never get answers. Also, there's Hyde Park Pet Cemetery. Tucked inside London's Hyde Park, there's a cemetery most people never see. It's not for humans, it's a Victorian-era pet cemetery, where where beloved pets of wealthy families were laid to rest. From lapdogs to exotic birds, over 300 animals are buried here, each with tiny gravestones carrying heartbreaking messages. But don't expect to stroll in. This cemetery is closed to the public. You can only visit during rare guided tours, and even then, access is limited. Part of it is to preserve the graves, but there's also an eerie sense that these animals and their owners wanted privacy, even in death. The gravestones tell stories of grief and love, with inscriptions like, "Darling Dolly, our sunshine." There's also the Cemetery of the Nameless in Vienna. There's a cemetery like no other, the Cemetery of the Nameless. It holds the bodies of people who drowned in the Danube River, but were never identified. These weren't peaceful deaths. Many were accidents, and their identities were lost to the water. Why can't you just walk in? This cemetery is hard to find and tucked away from main roads. The city keeps it quiet to protect the dignity of the unknown dead and to prevent it from becoming a tourist attraction. Many of the graves are simple, marked only by crosses or plaques reading "Unknown." And the mystery deepens. Mass graves are controversial even today. In Oldham, England lies a burial site so controversial it's rarely discussed. This grave holds the remains of stillborn infants and young children from the mid-20th century. Many parents never knew where their babies were buried. The hospital made those decisions without informing them. For decades, the location was kept secret. Families who lost children believed their babies were given private burials, only to discover later that they were placed in mass, unmarked graves. And also we have Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart's disappearance is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of all time. In 1937, while attempting to fly around the world, her plane vanished over the Pacific Ocean. Despite massive search efforts, no confirmed trace of her or her navigator, Fred Noonan, has ever been found. Theories about her fate range from crashing at sea to being stranded on a remote island. Some researchers believe her remains might lie beneath the ocean floor, while others think she lived out her days in secret. But after nearly 90 years, no official burial site has ever been identified. And her case isn't the only one. There's princes in the tower. In the 15th century, two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury, vanished inside the Tower of London. After their father, King Edward IV, died, the boys were sent to the tower, supposedly for their protection. But they were never seen again. Many believe their uncle, Richard III, ordered their murder to secure the throne. Centuries later, in 1674, workers discovered two small skeletons buried under a staircase in the tower. Were they the missing princes? No one knows for sure. Despite modern technology, these remains have never been fully examined or confirmed. But even ancient rulers can vanish without a trace, and no one proves this more than Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world, but no one knows where he's buried. After his death in 323 BCE, his body was placed in a golden sarcophagus and sent to Egypt. For centuries, travelers claimed to visit his tomb in Alexandria, but at some point it disappeared. Some believe natural disasters destroyed it, while others think it was deliberately hidden to protect it from grave robbers. Despite countless searches, no one has ever found the tomb. Even modern archaeologists, using advanced technology, have come up empty-handed. But not everyone's burial is a mystery. There's H.P. Lovecraft. When H.P. Lovecraft, the master of cosmic horror, died in 1937, his grave went unmarked. At the time, his work was barely known, and he died penniless. For decades, there was no sign he had ever been buried in Swan Point Cemetery in Providence, Rhode Island. That changed in 1977 when fans raised money to place a headstone at his burial site. They even inscribed a chilling phrase from his letters, "I am Providence." But even today, the grave isn't easy to find, tucked away from public paths. But for some, like John Belushi, hiding a grave is about more than privacy. John Belushi, the wild comedian from Saturday Night Live, was known for his larger-than-life personality, but his grave is surprisingly quiet. After his death in 1982, he was buried in Martha's Vineyard, but the location became a tourist magnet. Fans left beer cans, graffiti, and even worse on his tombstone. To protect his resting place, Belushi's family moved his headstone to a different spot in the cemetery. His actual grave remains unmarked to keep it private, while the headstone simply reads, "I may be gone, but rock and roll lives on." And he's not the only celebrity whose family wanted privacy. Some burials are hidden by choice, just like Roy Orbison. Despite his fame, Roy Orbison, the voice behind hits like "Oh, Pretty Woman," wanted no fanfare in death. When he died in 1988, his family honored his wish by burying him in an unmarked grave at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Orbison was known for being quiet and private, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. Even after his death, his family wanted to keep his resting place free from public intrusion. For years, no one outside his close circle knew where he was buried. Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was one of the architects of the Holocaust, responsible for organizing the deportation of millions of Jews to death camps. After World War II, he escaped to Argentina, but in 1960, Israeli agents captured him and brought him to trial. He was convicted and hanged in 1962. But unlike most executed criminals, Eichmann's body was not buried. Instead, the Israeli government had him cremated, and his ashes were scattered over the Mediterranean Sea outside of Israeli territory. This act was meant to ensure he had no physical grave where neo-Nazis or sympathizers could gather. And while some graves are hidden by force, others remain lost by choice, forever out of reach, just like Edgar Allan Poe. The famous writer of mysterious and macabre tales was originally buried in an unmarked grave in Baltimore. It wasn't until decades later that fans raised money to give him a proper headstone. However, the exact spot where he was buried remains unclear, adding to the mystery surrounding his life and death. To make things stranger, a mysterious visitor known as the Poe Toaster would leave roses and cognac at his grave every year. No one knows who they were. Finally, we have Bessie Smith, one of the greatest blues singers of all time. Bessie Smith was buried in an unmarked grave in Philadelphia after her tragic death in 1937. For years, her resting place went unrecognized until fellow singer Janis Joplin and a fan raised money to install a headstone in 1970. Even now, her grave remains tucked away and isn't widely visited. And there you have. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories. Click on the next video popping up on your screen. You won't want to miss what's coming next.